Hi guys, let's jump right into it.
Unanswered questions. The JFK assassination and Trump's declassified files. On a fog-laced morning in early 2025, a cold wind swept across Washington, D.C. as a silent drama decades in the making reached a tipping point. In a stark government building near the National Archives, crates of documents, sealed for over half a century, were finally unpacked and digitized. These were not just any documents. They were the last trove of classified files connected to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, released under the orders of former President Donald Trump during his second term. While the Kennedy assassination had long been dissected and theorized over, what these documents suggested was far from settled. Whispers of deception, covert operations, and conflicting allegiances now echoed more clearly. More than 60,000 pages, raw, unfiltered glimpses into Cold War-era intelligence, stood ready to reframe one of the most confounding moments in American history. Among the most provocative revelations were new insights into Lee Harvey Oswald's six-day trip to Mexico City in late September 1963. Long considered an enigmatic footnote, the trip now appeared to be of central importance. According to detailed surveillance reports from the newly unsealed files, Oswald visited the Soviet and Cuban embassies several times, pleading for transit visas to either Havana or Moscow. He had heated conversations, particularly at the Cuban consulate, where one report claimed he became visibly agitated when denied an expedited visa. What caught analysts' attention wasn't merely the visit itself, but who was watching. The documents revealed that Oswald had been under far tighter observation than previously acknowledged. A CIA informant in Mexico City filed a detailed report on Oswald's aggressive temperament and seemed to imply that U.S. officials were alerted about his embassy visits in real time. Internal memos from Langley circulated days after his trip, expressing concern that Oswald may become a volatile actor in our hemisphere operations. The implications were chilling. If elements within the CIA knew about Oswald's erratic behavior and growing radicalism prior to November 22nd, why wasn't more done? Equally troubling were the handwritten notes from then-Deputy CIA Director Richard Helms, who scribbled in a margin of a Mexico City memo. Need to monitor Oswald. Ties to Cubans unclear. Suggest handling via CI/SIG. The CI/SIG, or Counterintelligence Special Investigations Group, was a shadowy unit known for domestic tracking and covert files kept on U.S. citizens. For years, the agency had denied any such surveillance existed prior to Kennedy's murder. That veil had now lifted. Other files outlined the extent to which the CIA operated within U.S. borders, despite strict laws meant to prevent domestic spying. An internal security report from 1958 acknowledged that hundreds of CIA staff were actively involved in monitoring mail and communications across the country. The program, known informally as Tlingwell, was said to target foreign nationals. Yet one document from late 1961 listed Lee H. Oswald, New Orleans, as an intercept candidate based on his pro-Castro leanings. Oswald, it seemed, was not just a lone drifter with a rifle. He was a known entity. More documents focused on Operation Mongoose, the CIA-led campaign to sabotage and ultimately assassinate Fidel Castro. What started as targeted economic disruption had evolved by 1963 into a dark alliance with organized crime. The files confirmed years of speculation. The CIA did, in fact, attempt to use mafia figures like Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli to eliminate Castro. Their connection to Oswald remained unproven, but one memo warned of a potential crossover of assets between Mongoose operatives and hostile actors in New Orleans. A single redacted name appeared repeatedly in these documents, referenced as LHO's contact, sparking waves of online speculation. Some researchers now believe this individual was a Cuban exile operating between Dallas and Miami, with past involvement in anti-Castro paramilitary operations. The theory gaining traction? Oswald may have been manipulated into believing he was part of a larger mission, possibly one designed to implicate Castro's government. Other files, meanwhile, explored the mood inside the Kennedy White House during the months before the assassination. Tensions with the CIA had reached a breaking point. Kennedy's fury over the Bay of Pigs debacle and his pledge to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces had rattled the intelligence community. The documents include transcripts of a July 1963 National Security Council meeting in which Kennedy allegedly remarked, "We've got to take control of this place, the CIA. They're running their own damn government." It was a quote that haunted readers of the newly opened files, because only 4 months later, Kennedy would be dead. Perhaps the most unexpected revelation was the inclusion of multiple references to a previously unknown operation, codenamed Sable Echo. Few documents offered clarity on what Sable Echo entailed, but it was referenced in conjunction with surveillance activities involving both Oswald and individuals at the Cuban embassy in Mexico. A single paragraph, partially redacted, stated, "Sable Echo flagged Oswald's contact as high risk. Further evaluation scheduled, November 23rd. That date, just 1 day after Kennedy's assassination, stopped many researchers cold. The question echoed, why was Oswald still being evaluated the day after he allegedly acted alone? While the documents do not provide a smoking gun, they clearly indicate that U.S. intelligence agencies had far more prior knowledge about Oswald than they ever admitted. They also reveal the CIA's deep entanglement in Cold War plots that blurred the line between defense and conspiracy. Though the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone has never been formally overturned, these files pour gasoline on the fires of doubt that have long burned beneath the surface of the official narrative. The public reaction was swift and intense. Social media lit up with theories, connecting dots both logical and fantastical. Mainstream media outlets approached the documents with caution, unwilling to dive headfirst into speculation. Yet many investigative journalists and historians admitted that the files changed the picture, if only by exposing how much had been hidden. Former President Trump, in a rare interview following the release, said only, "The American people deserve to know what really happened. We were kept in the dark for too long." That darkness had started to lift. But what it revealed was not clarity. It was a hall of mirrors, reflecting shadow games played at the highest levels of power. As historians and independent investigators dug deeper into the documents, a new question emerged. Not just who killed Kennedy, but why so many in power seemed determined to keep the full truth buried. In the days following the document release, a quiet revolution began in academic circles and digital forums alike. Scholars who had spent decades studying the assassination found themselves rethinking everything. What had once been considered fringe theories were now getting re-examined under the hard light of newly revealed facts. It wasn't just about Oswald anymore. It was about who knew what and when. Among the most damning sections were internal memos from J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, dated just hours after Kennedy's assassination. One chilling document, sent to the Dallas field office, stated plainly, "There must be no doubt in the public's mind that Oswald is the only assassin." This directive wasn't a conclusion based on evidence. It was an instruction on narrative control. Another memo from the same day added, "We must contain speculation on this issue." The tone wasn't investigative. It was managerial. That language, historians argued, implied a coordinated effort to close the case before it could fully open. It cast a heavy shadow over the Warren Commission's formation just days later. The Commission's reliance on FBI and CIA intelligence now seemed less like pragmatism and more like containment. Many began asking, was the Warren Commission simply the vehicle for burying deeper truths? Some of the most tantalizing evidence in the new batch of files pointed to subtle pressure exerted on witnesses during the early days of the investigation. One document detailed a conversation between a mid-level FBI agent and a key witness from Dealey Plaza, who had initially described hearing gunshots from the grassy knoll. The memo recounted that the agent had persuaded the witness to reevaluate her statement in the interest of national security. The idea that witnesses were coached or even coerced to fit a predetermined narrative was no longer speculation. It was documented. The files also brought renewed focus to Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who killed Oswald 2 days after the assassination. Previously dismissed as an impulsive act by a patriotic citizen, Ruby's actions now took on a more ominous tone. Several unsealed memos revealed that Ruby had been flagged by the FBI multiple times before 1963 for his ties to organized crime. One note, marked confidential, detailed Ruby's attendance at a 1962 meeting in Chicago between suspected mob figures and an unknown government intermediary. That same note mentioned Ruby's increasing desperation over unpaid debts and the loss of his club's liquor license, a punishment that, as the memo cryptically stated, could be reversed if he cooperates. More importantly, a 1964 interview transcript, previously redacted, showed that Ruby begged the Warren Commission to relocate him to Washington, D.C., claiming his life was in danger in the Dallas jail. He insisted that a larger force was at play and that he feared they'll silence me next. The commission ignored his request. These documents reframed Ruby not as a vigilante, but as a man caught in a cross-current of fear, manipulation, and cover-up. As analysts combed through the thousands of pages, they began identifying patterns, codes, names, and phrases repeated across years and unrelated case files. One such term, the lacuna, appeared in 4 separate intelligence memos, always tied to discussions about Cuban intelligence and domestic infiltrators. Its meaning remained elusive, but one heavily redacted file dated December 1963 linked it to a surveillance program run out of Miami. The few visible lines indicated that lacuna operatives were tasked with identifying U.S. citizens sympathetic to hostile regimes, and some analysts now speculated whether Oswald had unknowingly crossed their path. What disturbed many readers the most, however, was how clear the lines of potential foreknowledge appeared in hindsight. A CIA operations file dated November 12, 1963, just 10 days before the assassination, mentioned a pending high-profile national security risk tied to a former defector now returned from Soviet territory. The defector, never named outright, was clearly Oswald. The memo concluded with an eerie line: should action become necessary, extreme deniability is paramount. Buried among less explosive files were transcripts of internal CIA debates about Kennedy's perceived softness on Cuba and Vietnam. In one meeting summary, dated October 1963, a high-ranking official referred to the president's plans to withdraw from Vietnam as naive at best, dangerous at worst. The notes suggested that the intelligence community felt increasingly alienated from Kennedy's foreign policy direction. One marginal note read, "We may need to take our own precautions if policy continues on this trajectory." That single sentence sparked a frenzy in the research community. Was it rhetorical frustration or something more? Outside the corridors of academia, the public was grappling with this new avalanche of data. Polls showed a sharp increase in Americans who now believed the assassination involved more than a lone gunman. Television pundits danced carefully around the implications, but online forums dug deep. Independent investigators pored over old crime scene photos, mapping them against the new documents to hunt for inconsistencies. A new wave of documentaries and podcasts surged to fill the void, many of them connecting the dots with an almost feverish intensity. In the midst of the uproar, a whistleblower emerged. A retired CIA analyst, speaking under the pseudonym Archer, came forward in a widely circulated interview. Claiming to have worked on an internal post-mortem of Kennedy's assassination in 1975, Archer stated that senior officials had suppressed dozens of internal reviews because they contradicted the Warren Commission's conclusions. "There was never a single narrative," he said. "There were versions, and we picked the one that kept the country stable." Archer described an internal memo he'd seen in 1976 that concluded, multiple parties had motive, means, and opportunity, but no singular directive exists. In other words, the intelligence community couldn't prove a conspiracy, but couldn't disprove it either. Archer's credibility was immediately challenged, but the timing of his appearance, so close to the declassification wave, gave weight to his claims. More importantly, some of the details he mentioned, code names, document reference numbers, aligned with content from the newly released files. It was enough to shift the tone from mere conspiracy theory to plausible alternative history. At the heart of the renewed investigation sat a single haunting question. If so many people knew something, why didn't anyone stop it? Forensic experts revisited the ballistic evidence, this time with access to clearer photos and enhanced film footage that had been digitally restored by the archives. Questions resurfaced about the trajectory of the so-called magic bullet, and new computer simulations raised fresh doubts. When overlaid with the original Zapruder film and now unsealed autopsy notes, the likelihood of a second shooter was no longer easily dismissed. Even the famed 3 shots theory came under fire. One audio analyst, using advanced waveform mapping, reconstructed the ambient sounds from Dealey Plaza recorded on a police dictabelt. His conclusion: 4 distinct sound events matched to rifle discharge signatures. Not 3, 4. And then, finally, a cryptic memo surfaced from 1964, addressed to CIA Director John McCone. Most of it was blacked out, but the subject line read, "Post-event contingency narrative management." It was bureaucratic language, bland on the surface, but loaded with implication. The event was Kennedy's death. The contingency was the story the world would be told. As one researcher put it, we weren't just handed a version of history, we were handed a script. And now, 60 years later, that script was unraveling. As the narrative began to crumble, so too did the confidence in the institutions that had built and maintained it. The revelations sparked congressional rumblings. A bipartisan coalition of senators quietly drafted proposals for a new inquiry, not another commission bound by bureaucracy, but a forensic re-examination with subpoena power and independent oversight. The public pressure was mounting. No longer content with ambiguous truths and well-crafted official statements, Americans demanded full transparency. Meanwhile, investigative journalists continued to pull at threads. One lead centered around the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, which had historically played a lesser-known but significant role in tracking Oswald following his defection to the Soviet Union. Newly declassified Navy reports revealed that Oswald's file had been opened months before his return to the U.S. in 1962, and what was startling was how detailed it was. Not just his whereabouts, but intercepted letters, interactions with Russian contacts, and even a psychological profile assessing his need for significance. A side note scrawled in red ink on one ONI memo asked a cryptic question: is subject being handled by another agency? Whoever wrote that note, identity redacted, suspected early on that Oswald wasn't acting in isolation. The memo referenced a liaison meeting with CIA personnel at Camp Peary, the facility known as the Farm, where agency operatives received clandestine training. There was no definitive proof that Oswald had been trained there, but the implication lingered like smoke in a sealed room. Another startling piece of information came from a report detailing surveillance of Oswald's interactions in New Orleans. A file dated August 1963 described a gathering in a back room of a bakery owned by a Cuban exile known only by the alias Raul. According to the report, Oswald delivered a fiery monologue about American imperialism, claiming that a powerful symbol must fall to awaken the working class. The attendees, some of whom were informants, described his tone as erratic but impassioned. The report was flagged but ultimately buried. Why? No clear answer. Just another dead end, or deliberate detour. By now, 2 distinct schools of thought were emerging among researchers. One side believed Oswald was a manipulated pawn, guided subtly by handlers within intelligence networks, possibly without fully understanding his own role. The other side claimed he might have been part of a failed sting operation, a false defector meant to infiltrate communist circles who then went rogue. Both theories found support in the new files. Both had damning implications for the agencies involved. And then came the Lisbon cable. Hidden within a set of unrelated diplomatic transmissions was a CIA cable dated October 29, 1963, sent from the U.S. Embassy in Lisbon to Langley headquarters. It referenced a known associate of LHO transiting through Portugal en route to Mexico. The name was redacted, but the timing matched known travel records of a Cuban intelligence officer whose whereabouts had previously been lost in the fog of history. The cable concluded, subject is aware of potential asset in Dallas. Coordinated contact not advised at this time. Asset. In Dallas. The term was clinical, but its weight was enormous. If Oswald was considered an asset, then it meant he was under some level of control, or at least observation. Researchers flooded online archives, comparing timelines, building interactive maps, overlaying photographs and documents into sprawling digital repositories. As the evidence mounted, the dots began connecting in uncomfortable ways. The name David Atlee Phillips reemerged, a CIA officer whose links to anti-Castro operations, Mexico City surveillance, and psychological operations made him a recurring figure in assassination literature. Several new documents confirmed Phillips had been in Mexico City during Oswald's visit. One internal memo quoted Phillips warning colleagues to eliminate any photographic trace of the embassy encounter, a reference believed to concern Oswald's meeting at the Cuban consulate. In the original investigation, the CIA claimed no usable photos of Oswald's embassy visits existed. But a 2025 released logbook from the photo surveillance team clearly listed Anglo male, mid-20s, height 5 feet 10 inches, enters consulate, September 27th. That matched Oswald's description. If photos had existed, what happened to them? That question, small in its phrasing but enormous in consequence, stood as a metaphor for the entire investigation. Every missing image, every redacted name, every vanished document now felt less like accident and more like design. One journalist described it perfectly. It wasn't that they didn't know. It's that they didn't want us to. But the damage was done. A flood of books, exposés, and documentaries followed, armed with the new evidence and unflinching in their conclusions. Some posited a CIA cover-up, others a rogue operation buried by bureaucratic panic. A few ventured even further, exploring the possibility that Kennedy's assassination had been tacitly approved by a consortium of anti-Castro exiles, organized crime, and disaffected intelligence operatives, all bound by mutual interest and fear of Kennedy's next move, détente with the USSR and a withdrawal from Vietnam. Vietnam, that peace, long overshadowed, now re-entered the conversation. A declassified State Department memo from October 1963 outlined Kennedy's growing disillusionment with U.S. military involvement in Southeast Asia. He had drafted National Security Action Memorandum 263, authorizing the withdrawal of 1,000 troops by year's end. Another memo from the Joint Chiefs warned that such a move would severely undermine strategic containment in the region and project weakness to adversaries. Tensions between the Pentagon and the White House were higher than the public ever knew. Kennedy was, in the eyes of some, becoming a liability. The weight of this context reshaped the emotional contours of the assassination. It was no longer just a national tragedy. It became, in the minds of many, a political correction, a turning point engineered to maintain the Cold War status quo. The aftermath made sense through that lens. The escalation in Vietnam, the rollback of détente, the ascension of hardline foreign policy advisors. What once seemed like coincidence began to feel like choreography. The press, pushed by public interest, began to report more aggressively. Front pages once cautious were now publishing pieces titled Lies, Loopholes, and Lee Harvey Oswald, and the war they didn't want Kennedy to end. Talk shows booked historians and whistleblowers in equal measure. Congressional leaders hinted at hearings. For a brief moment, the American public was united in suspicion and demand. And through it all, the haunting image remained. A president in an open-top car, waving to a hopeful crowd. A burst of gunfire. A nation paused in horror. Now, finally, that moment was no longer framed as a sudden rupture in an otherwise steady story, but as the crescendo of a buried battle for control, cloaked in loyalty, secrecy, and silence. The silence was ending. With the silence broken, pressure surged from the streets of Washington to the quiet corners of Langley. Leaks became more frequent. The National Archives struggled to keep pace with journalists and historians filing Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests, now laser-focused, informed by patterns and code names found in the declassified troves. Public trust in federal intelligence agencies, already diminished over the decades, hit another low. But one final cluster of documents released in early 2025 caused the biggest stir yet. These weren't field reports or memo summaries. They were internal communications, strategic briefings, and a collection of back-channel correspondences between CIA Director John McCone and former Vice President Richard Nixon. They had been misfiled in the bureaucratic sense of being intentionally mislabeled and buried under innocuous headings like trade policy, Brazil, 1963. When rediscovered, they provided the deepest insight yet into the political calculations that surrounded Kennedy's assassination, not just before, but in its aftermath. One such document, A hand-typed letter dated December 2nd, 1963, bore Nixon's personal letterhead. In it, Nixon thanked McCone for a calming influence during troubling times and noted cryptically, "I trust we have redirected the ship from turbulent waters back toward clarity and resolve." The message was received. It became the most analyzed phrase in the document cache. What message? Who received it? Speculation mounted that this was less about grief and more about satisfaction, a suggestion that Kennedy's death had served a broader purpose, welcomed by powerful stakeholders not just in Washington but internationally. Supporting this theory was another file, a report marked Secret, Eyes Only, summarizing a post-assassination strategy session held at the Office of National Estimates, where senior CIA analysts and contractors discussed the global implications of the assassination. The report bluntly noted, "Initial shock may yield to a realignment of influence across SE Asia. Stabilization through continuity may prove advantageous." The phrase continuity had always been a euphemism for power retention. In this context, it dripped with irony. Meanwhile, Oswald's shadow only deepened. Analysts had begun feeding all of Oswald's known writings, letters, diary entries, statements, into natural language processing systems. Patterns began to emerge. Certain phrases recurred, mirroring the phrasing found in psychological conditioning protocols used in CIA's controversial MKUltra program. One particularly chilling linguistic match linked Oswald's phrasing in his Fair Play for Cuba pamphlet to known test scripts used on military volunteers during early conditioning trials in the late 50s. Could Oswald have been subjected to manipulation at that level? Was he a lone wolf, or a groomed one? That question tore through the public imagination. In a televised interview, a former Air Force psychologist who'd assisted in early MKUltra-related research claimed, "You could implant ideological triggers. The technology was crude, but the effects were real, especially on someone already disillusioned and isolated like Oswald." It wasn't definitive proof, but it was fuel to a growing fire. At the heart of all of this sat one final figure, Donald Trump. Though most of the documents had been declassified by law under the JFK Records Act, it was Trump's decision in 2018 and again in 2020 to selectively release large portions of the remaining files that accelerated the storm. At the time, critics dismissed it as theatrics. But in hindsight, it was the move that shattered decades of silence. Trump himself, in interviews and off-the-cuff remarks, often teased the importance of the files. In one 2019 speech, he said, "There are people who still don't want the whole story out, and you wouldn't believe how high up they go. But I said, let's get it out. Let's show the people." In 2024, during a post-presidency interview, he doubled down. They were hiding things. You see it in black and white now. Oswald didn't act alone. Everyone knows it. He wasn't the originator of this suspicion, but his actions, possibly motivated by ego, vengeance, or simple showmanship, opened the dam. And in doing so, he inadvertently connected the most shocking murder of the 20th century to the political battles of the 21st. More than just political theater, Trump's declassification orders triggered a cultural reckoning. Historians who had long played it safe now stepped forward. Former intelligence officials, emboldened or perhaps guilt-ridden, broke NDAs. Even Hollywood took notice. Scripts were rushed into development, not fictionalized accounts, but dramatized breakdowns of what the documents revealed, focusing on interagency rivalries, rogue actors, and the paranoia that defined the Cold War's darkest corners. It was no longer a story about a man with a rifle in a book depository. It was about the invisible gears behind the curtain, the machinery of state, the calculation of risk, the preference for narrative over truth. As more files were digitized, a younger generation began connecting their own dots. A group of Gen Z coders launched a crowdsourced AI-powered analysis project called Prism, compiling every newly released JFK document into a searchable, cross-referenced engine. Within weeks, Prism had mapped over 14,000 relationships between key figures, some obvious, like Oswald and Ruby, but others obscure. Cuban emigres connected to Langley safe houses, FBI agents who retired mysteriously early, military officers reassigned after the assassination. One name began surfacing repeatedly: William K. Harvey. Once a little-known CIA officer involved in Cuban sabotage programs, Harvey had long vanished into post-agency obscurity. But the files painted a different picture. He had met with a liaison from Operation Mongoose just 3 weeks before Dallas. One memo referred to a Harvey asset with Dallas proximity. Another noted he had access to triangulation logistics used in foreign assassinations. Harvey's death in 1976 had been ruled a stroke. But the final file in his folder, released in 2025, was a security clearance renewal form, filed 2 months before his death, with a notation, "Restricted, see Appendix Orpheus." That appendix has not yet been located. Researchers now believe Orpheus may be the final code name in a classified program, one not referenced in any other JFK file. If real, it may be the last remaining vault of knowledge about what really happened in Dallas that day. The government, under renewed pressure, has promised further disclosures. But trust remains fractured. For many Americans, the damage is already done. The truth wasn't hidden in a single file. It was scattered across decades, buried under bureaucracy and fear. In the end, the documents didn't give one definitive answer. They gave hundreds of clues, all pointing to one certainty. The story we were told, of a lone gunman, a confused drifter, a spontaneous act of violence, wasn't just incomplete. It was a fiction. As 2025 wore on, and the last of the declassified files trickled into public archives, the American public found itself confronting not just historical revision, but something deeper, more unsettling: historical betrayal. The new JFK files didn't offer a tidy ending. Instead, they presented a mosaic of implication, a series of intersecting paths, hints, and veiled connections that challenged the foundations of the official story. It wasn't one man with a rifle, nor a clear, coordinated conspiracy. It was worse, a deliberate, institutional refusal to tell the truth. Perhaps the most jarring revelation came from a batch of memos from the CIA's Special Activities Division. Dated early November 1963, they referenced a domestic contingency involving what one operative called executive interference protocols. These documents included language typically reserved for foreign coups and regime destabilization. But in this context, the subject was domestic. An internal report listed Dallas among several high-visibility transit targets. While no names were included, the memo discussed scenarios involving emergency continuity of government and retaliatory perception management in the event of command disruption. Though vague, the implications were chilling. Somewhere within the deep architecture of the intelligence community, JFK's removal had been gamed out, not just as a possibility, but as a scenario requiring public control. As this information came to light, media narratives shifted dramatically. Major networks hosted nightly specials breaking down the documents, bringing in historians, whistleblowers, and digital investigators who had combed the records day and night. Suddenly, figures once dismissed as conspiracy theorists were elevated to expert status. Not all of them were right, but many had been close. Public confidence in the Warren Commission report, which had long stood as the government's official account, plummeted. The commission's conclusions had always felt incomplete, but now they appeared willfully narrow, tailored to fit a story acceptable to the public and manageable for the institutions involved. One by one, the myths fell. Lee Harvey Oswald, presented to the public as a volatile Marxist and unhinged loner, now appeared to be under surveillance for years prior to the assassination. His file showed irregularities, disappearances, missing entries, and access codes not typical for civilians. He had been on the radar of multiple agencies simultaneously, yet none intervened. Or perhaps, as new theories suggested, intervention wasn't the goal at all. The Mexico City trip, long a centerpiece of Oswald's supposed foreign ties, took on new dimensions. The CIA had initially reported a lack of photographic evidence confirming Oswald's consulate visits. But the newly released technical logs from surveillance stations revealed that all footage from September 27 to 28, 1963, had been ordered for routine purge by someone with a clearance level tied to the agency's counterintelligence branch. In other words, the records had been erased, not due to oversight, but on purpose. A name kept resurfacing: James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's legendary counterintelligence chief, whose paranoia and labyrinthine operations shaped much of the Cold War intelligence landscape. Angleton had always been an enigma, and now, with the release of his private correspondences, that enigma deepened. In a 1967 letter to a former Mossad contact, he wrote, "History is written not by the victors, but by the survivors. And sometimes the difference is paper." The letter was included in a personal file labeled Winterbird. Investigators still aren't sure what the codename refers to, but several speculate it was Angleton's internal operation focused on controlling the JFK narrative. Winterbird documents included interview records, press contact logs, and behavioral profiling of journalists. The deeper into the records one dove, the more a pattern emerged. This wasn't just about hiding the truth, it was about shaping perception, managing the American psyche, and the operation had worked. For decades, the public had been lulled into passive acceptance. A young man had shot the president. He was caught. He was killed. End of story. But now, that story was overrun by others. One of the most damning came from a retired FBI agent who had been stationed in New Orleans during Oswald's time there. In a sworn affidavit submitted to a congressional subcommittee, he revealed that he had forwarded concerns to the Bureau about Oswald's contacts with local mob figures, specifically associates of Carlos Marcello. His report was marked too speculative, no follow-up. Yet, in the declassified files, the same report had been altered, stripped of references to organized crime, and filed under low-priority domestic activity. The FBI hadn't just ignored leads. They'd reworded them. And what about Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who shot Oswald on live television, claiming grief and rage? A long-hidden psychiatric evaluation of Ruby surfaced, revealing that he had been in contact with a Dallas-based FBI informant just 2 days before the shooting. The informant's identity remains redacted, but Ruby's statements in the evaluation, "They'll know I was told what to do, and I was set up to silence the noise," suggest he acted under more pressure than previously understood. Further still, the newly available telephone log showed Ruby made a call the morning of November 24th to a number traced to an unlisted line in Arlington, Virginia, a number now confirmed to have belonged to a CIA field office. All of this fed a new cultural movement. Young activists demanded justice, not necessarily in the form of trials, as most of the key players were now long dead, but in accountability, institutional reform, and public recognition of the deception. Documentaries aired on streaming platforms. University courses were redesigned. National monuments were quietly amended. The eternal flame at Kennedy's grave became, in some sense, a symbol not just of remembrance, but of unhealed truth. By the summer of 2025, a new congressional committee had been established, the first in over 40 years to reinvestigate the JFK assassination. But this time, the committee wasn't shackled by Cold War pressures or fears of national embarrassment. It had teeth, subpoena power, a mandate for transparency. At its first public hearing, a striking statement was made by the committee chair. "We may never find the singular truth, but we can no longer live inside a lie." It was, in its way, a national catharsis. The public, so used to being spectators of its own history, was now active. School children debated the meaning of deep state. Coffee shop conversations turned to Dallas like it had happened last week. A nation, once divided along partisan lines, found shared ground in a betrayal that transcended ideology. And Donald Trump, polarizing as ever, watched from the sidelines with a self-satisfied smirk. "Told you," he tweeted one morning. "They never wanted you to know." Whatever his motivations, he had been right about one thing. The truth, buried under decades of red tape and omission, had always been there, waiting. By fall of 2025, America was in a state of psychological awakening. The JFK files were no longer just documents. They had become symbols. Symbols of a government that once hid the truth to protect itself. Symbols of a citizenry that had, for too long, accepted the surface story. And perhaps most unexpectedly, symbols of how fragile the line between democracy and control truly is. As the new congressional committee dug deeper, they uncovered one last shocking piece. A set of transcripts and internal reports from a Cold War project called Operation Dormouse. Buried deep in the Defense Intelligence Agency's archives and misfiled under nuclear preparedness documents, Dormouse was a psychological operations program developed to assess and manipulate mass public perception following high-impact political events. Originally designed in response to fears of Soviet-style propaganda, the operation had evolved into a domestic testbed. One of its test scenarios? A national trauma simulation centered around the loss of a popular leader. The records didn't outright state the JFK assassination was the live trial, but the timing, language, and redacted subject indicators left little room for doubt. Dormouse, as outlined in its internal papers, wasn't about prevention. It was about prediction and management. According to the logs, the project ran simulations using early computer models to estimate how Americans would react to differing versions of a presidential assassination: lone gunman, foreign conspiracy, organized crime, or internal plot. In every scenario except the lone gunman, civil unrest, breakdown of trust, and even regional insurrection were predicted outcomes. The optimal belief vector, as the documents called it, was one where a disturbed individual acted alone, motivated by fringe ideology, with limited state interference. It was a manufactured story, and the entire system had been calibrated to deliver it. The revelation reignited fury across the country. Protests erupted not just in Washington, but in cities like Chicago, Dallas, and Boston. People held signs that read, "We were programmed," and "Dormouse equals mind control." Conspiracy theories flourished, not all of them grounded, but all of them fueled by one undeniable fact. Manipulation had replaced transparency long ago. In an emergency press conference, the acting director of national intelligence admitted that the Dormouse project did exist and was active through the late 1960s, but denied it was ever applied to real events. Few believed him, but among the noise, something new emerged. A unity of purpose, not around a political figure, but around the demand for historical clarity. Across generations and political ideologies, people wanted to reclaim the story, to take it back from the bureaucracy and give it back to the people who had lived it, mourned it, and been lied to about it. Veterans of the Kennedy era stepped forward with testimonials. Former aides, surviving members of Kennedy's security detail, even foreign leaders. A declassified British intelligence report from 1964, previously held under UK official secrets protections, was published, revealing that MI6 had suspected internal instability in the American executive structure in the weeks following JFK's death. In other words, our closest allies never fully believed the lone gunman theory either. Meanwhile, Oswald's own life continued to unravel under the weight of this new light. More connections surfaced, this time pointing toward George de Mohrenschildt, a mysterious Russian émigré and apparent CIA asset who had mentored Oswald during his Dallas years. A newly unearthed State Department memo referenced a confidential warning from de Mohrenschildt in 1962. He is unstable, yes, but he listens very well. A perfect subject for those with patience. The memo had been ignored. De Mohrenschildt's suicide in 1977 had long been treated as an isolated tragedy. But now, with new forensic reanalysis, prompted by independent investigators and journalists, it appeared his death may not have been self-inflicted. The angle, the residue patterns, the lack of a suicide note, it all fit a familiar pattern. Silencing. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was history catching up with reality. And then came the name that changed everything again, George Joanides. Joanides had been the CIA's liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s. At the time, he presented himself as a mid-level bureaucrat with no direct ties to the events under investigation. But in 2025, declassified personnel files confirmed what many had suspected. Joanides had supervised anti-Castro Cuban exile groups in New Orleans during Oswald's exact period of activity there. He hadn't just known about Oswald. He had been running operations in his orbit. Even worse, during the 1970s investigation, Joanides had actively suppressed documents that tied these exile groups to both the CIA and Oswald. The revelation transformed him from background bureaucrat to central figure in the obstruction. The committee rebranded him the gatekeeper. In response, a bipartisan bill was introduced to reform the declassification process entirely, removing final authority from intelligence agencies and placing it in the hands of an independent civilian oversight board. It passed the House in record time. But amid the legislative efforts and historical reckonings, something quieter was happening. A generational shift. People no longer wanted to simply know what happened. They wanted to understand why the truth had been so heavily guarded. Historians began reframing the Kennedy assassination as not just a singular event, but the beginning of the modern American security state. It marked a turning point where secrecy became the default, where surveillance grew unchecked, where institutions stopped serving the people and began managing them. In a widely shared op-ed titled, "Dallas Was the Day We Lost the Plot," cultural theorist Maya Hennessy wrote, "It's not that the government killed the president. It's that they killed the truth. And from that moment on, we were never the same." America didn't break when Kennedy died. It broke when we stopped asking why. Her words resonated. In classrooms, on social media, in the minds of those who had lived through it and those born decades after. By the close of 2025, the National Archives had created a digital JFK evidence repository, fully open source, updated in real time, supported by universities, journalists, and independent watchdogs. AI tools helped visualize connections, patterns, and document lineage. People could explore the files themselves, draw their own conclusions, test theories, contribute findings. Truth had gone from something delivered to something discovered. And still, the final questions lingered. Had the plot been orchestrated at the highest levels? Or had a web of small decisions, biases, cover-ups, and fear spiraled into a cataclysm? Was it one man or many? Was it an assassination or a coup of convenience? In a sense, the answer no longer mattered as much as the journey toward it. The Kennedy assassination, after 6 decades of silence, had finally begun to speak again. And the people, armed now with facts, files, and an unshakable skepticism, were listening. By early 2026, the term post-truth took on a new meaning in the American psyche, not as a symptom of modern politics, but as a legacy born in Dealey Plaza. The assassination of John F. Kennedy had become a prism through which generations examined the gap between what happened, what was said to have happened, and why those two often diverged. The newly empowered Congressional Committee, now dubbed the Historical Integrity Commission, brought together the sharpest legal minds, historians, intelligence veterans, and citizen researchers. Their purpose wasn't prosecution, it was reclamation. They wanted to rebuild the narrative brick by brick, piece by verified piece. And perhaps the most shocking piece came not from the CIA or FBI, but the Secret Service. Among a final tranche of files declassified from the Executive Protective Division was a series of interagency memoranda titled Project Sabre. The memos, dated November 1963, revealed something long suspected but never confirmed: a scheduled change in presidential protection protocols, canceled days before JFK's trip to Dallas. According to the documents, Secret Service agents had proposed a closed-car configuration for high-risk urban motorcades, particularly in cities with recent threats or known instability. Dallas qualified on both counts. The plan was simple: install a temporary transparent canopy, lightweight and bullet-resistant, for all upcoming appearances in hostile or unpredictable environments. The canopy was ordered. Then, abruptly, the order was rescinded. No clear reason was listed, only a notation from a deputy director reading, "POTUS prefers visibility. Request override honored." But a secondary note, scribbled in pencil in the margin, complicated that. Override came from higher than POTUS. Disregard request. There was no indication of who made the decision. The phrasing, higher than POTUS, didn't make literal sense. But to intelligence insiders, the meaning was unmistakable. Someone within the inner intelligence military nexus had the authority, or at least the influence, to overrule a presidential preference. It raised the terrifying prospect that the president wasn't always the final word. This set off a media firestorm. News anchors quoted the phrase on air, shaking their heads in disbelief. Editorials exploded with speculation. And for the first time, even previously skeptical pundits admitted, something larger, something systemic, had happened in November 1963. The phrase, higher than POTUS, entered public consciousness like a virus. Shirts were printed, murals painted. It became a kind of shorthand for the hidden hand behind power, a modern mythology backed by declassified fact. And then, a breakthrough. A researcher from Georgetown University uncovered a pattern within the Dormouse documents, a list of code names labeled archive compartments. Each codename corresponded to a secure archive cell, some still active. Most had benign names: Tricycle, Blue Cloud, Echo, 17, but one stood out: Night Window. It was listed next to a now-defunct project related to executive anomaly resolution. When cross-referenced with recently released files from the Department of Defense, Night Window revealed itself to be an off-book intelligence circle, operating between 1959 and 1965, designed to assess and respond to presidential deviation from operational alignment. In layman's terms, they watched for presidents who strayed too far from the national security agenda. Kennedy, with his pushback against the CIA after the Bay of Pigs, his tentative steps toward détente with Khrushchev, and his desire to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces, fit the profile perfectly. Night Window monitored him. They didn't act directly, but they tracked, shared assessments, noted vulnerabilities. One report dated October 31st, 1963, summarized JFK's behavior as increasingly erratic from a strategic standpoint, potentially destabilizing to long-term national posture. The summary ended with a stark phrase: Phase 2 protocols may be warranted. What were Phase 2 protocols? That's what the commission aimed to find out. Testimony from a retired Air Force intelligence officer, given in a closed-door session and later leaked to the press, suggested Phase 2 was a euphemism for scenario stabilization, which could include decapitation of the chain of command under select conditions. Not necessarily assassination, but replacement. Suddenly, it wasn't about whether there was a shooter on the grassy knoll. It was about whether Kennedy's presidency had been quietly deemed too risky to national interests, and whether the state itself, fragmented, compartmentalized, faceless, had reacted to protect continuity. The implications were chilling, and yet, they matched what people already felt in their bones. That something too clean had replaced something too messy. That a real, flawed, visionary leader had been replaced, first by silence, then by mythology. The cumulative weight of the revelations was having cultural consequences. JFK's image, once idealized, was now deeply humanized. His flaws, womanizing, political pragmatism, warhawk roots, were acknowledged openly. But his virtues, his curiosity, his refusal to be boxed in by doctrine, his ability to inspire, shone brighter than ever. Schools revamped history curriculums to include a full JFK module. Netflix greenlit a 10-part docuseries called The Lie in the Lens. Filmmakers revisited the Zapruder film not as a mystery to be solved, but a national trauma to be confronted. Even Congress changed. The Historical Integrity Commission announced that its final report would not merely offer conclusions, but recommendations. New laws governing declassification time limits, external review boards for intelligence operations, and psychological support for whistleblowers. The past, finally, was pushing the future into reform. But not all reactions were constructive. A splinter group emerged online, claiming the assassination was not only a coup, but part of an ongoing operation that had never ended. Their rhetoric was aggressive, paranoid, and sometimes violent. They believed the truth could never be fully known because the same forces were still in control. They rejected the commission, the documents, even Trump's release of files, labeling it all managed disclosure. Their emergence reminded the public, truth can be a unifying force, but also a destabilizing one. It had to be handled carefully, and through all of it, Donald Trump remained a chaotic figure in the background. His decision to release the documents, partly out of genuine conviction, partly for political theater, had triggered the cascade. Now, he was leveraging that fact for his own legacy. "I did what no one else dared to do," he said at a Florida rally. "I gave you the truth, and they hate me for it." People didn't know whether to cheer or cringe. But one thing was clear: the system had cracked open, and it wasn't closing again. By the time spring 2026 arrived, the Historical Integrity Commission was preparing its final phase, a cross-institutional review to determine what systemic safeguards failed, not just in 1963, but in the years afterward. They weren't hunting a smoking gun anymore. They were studying the machinery that allowed smoke to spread for 60 years unchecked. What had happened to JFK was tragic, but what had happened to America in the aftermath, that was the true crime. Summer 2026 arrived like a breath held too long, released at last. The country had passed through mourning, fury, revelation, and now stood on the edge of something quieter, more enduring. Not closure. That was a myth. But comprehension. The Historical Integrity Commission published its final report on July 4, 2026. Titled The Veil and the Mirror, it was 3,200 pages long, structured in 6 volumes, and read like a cross between a classified operations manual and a confessional. It contained hundreds of new declassifications, expert analyses, and verified witness accounts that spanned from 1959 to 2025. But its power wasn't just in what it proved, it was in how it reshaped understanding. The commission didn't claim to know who pulled the trigger in Dealey Plaza. It didn't need to. What it showed, in painstaking and disturbing detail, was that America's intelligence and security structure had drifted from accountability long before November 22, 1963, and that the assassination of a sitting president, whether planned or exploited, had been possible only because no one was watching the watchers. Some of the report's most unsettling findings. Night Window, the shadow monitoring group, had existed without formal oversight and with mission drift, creeping from policy analysis into executive behavioral profiling. The Secret Service, under immense institutional pressure, had accepted vulnerabilities in Dallas against its own judgment, bowing to external preference signals without full understanding of the risks. The CIA, through George Jonides and other assets, had maintained indirect contact with Oswald via anti-Castro Cuban groups, but never disclosed this to the Warren Commission or Congress. Oswald's travels to Mexico City in the weeks before the assassination had triggered alerts at multiple agencies, alerts that were deliberately misrouted or neutralized, per a now unsealed NSA communication intercept. Internal memos across 1963 show a pattern of coordination, not of a plot, but of containment. Once the assassination happened, the priority wasn't truth, it was stability. And so, the lie began. The conclusion wasn't the smoking gun many had hoped for, but it was something more profound. The assassination of John F. Kennedy cannot be reduced to a single motive, actor, or event. It was the result of structural failure across multiple institutions, each acting in isolation, secrecy, and fear. The truth was not hidden by a puppet master, but by a system that no longer served the people who trusted it. Reactions were swift. President Maya Gonzalez addressed the nation that night in a speech simulcast across every network. We now know the institutions meant to protect our democracy were themselves in need of protection, not from enemies abroad, but from unchecked power within. We cannot rewrite the past, but we can write a new future, one built not on secrecy, but on shared truth. The following week, Congress passed the National Transparency Reformation Act, which included a 25-year maximum classification limit for federal records, no exceptions, civilian-led review panels for intelligence programs, mandatory training on constitutional ethics for national security staff, and perhaps most boldly, the JFK Doctrine, which required that all presidential protection and intelligence oversight include independent legal observers with direct public reporting channels. For the first time, the watchers would be watched. Across the country, memorials shifted. The eternal flame at Arlington burned a little brighter. New plaques were added in Dallas, not just remembering Kennedy, but honoring whistleblowers, investigators, and ordinary citizens who refused to stop asking. At the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, a new wing opened, the Truth Room. It displayed not only historical records, but the Commission's findings, interactive timelines, and testimony from those silenced or ignored for decades. School children toured it daily, but the story didn't end in a museum. In a quiet corner of Louisiana, a frail but lucid woman named Ruth Payne recorded her final interview. Her home had once housed Oswald's wife, Marina. She had lived with the burden of proximity to history and the suspicion that never left her. But her last words to the interviewer were unexpectedly hopeful. "I don't know everything, but I know the difference between a lie and a silence. And I'm glad the silence is finally broken." Others followed her lead. Retired agents, Cuban exiles, a grandson of a man once stationed at Langley. The Oral History Project grew until it filled terabytes of testimony. The government wasn't just telling the truth now, the people were reclaiming it. And Lee Harvey Oswald, he remained a cipher. Perhaps he fired the fatal shots. Perhaps he was a pawn. Perhaps both. The files suggested he was unstable, ambitious, and easily manipulated. He had made contact with too many people, in too many places, with too many motives. What was clear, he had been watched, studied, moved through a system that rarely noticed its own machinery until it was too late. In the final chapter of The Veil and the Mirror, the Commission wrote, Oswald did not act alone. He was acted upon, pushed and pulled by forces he did not fully understand. And in that way, he became the perfect instrument, not of conspiracy, but of convergence. For a country obsessed with the grassy knoll, the magic bullet, the dark room in Langley, this was a radical reframing. The truth wasn't simple or cinematic. It was messy, bureaucratic, human. 1,000 missed chances, 100 silenced voices, 1 moment of violence, 60 years of confusion. Now light. And in that light, people moved forward, not forgetting, not forgiving, but finally understanding. Because in the end, the assassination of John F. Kennedy was not just about the death of a man. It was about the moment a nation realized its institutions could fail, and the generations that fought, against all odds, to make sure they never failed again.